The story of a kingdom's rise and collapse does not begin with a single event, but with a slow, quiet shift in the hearts of the people and the leaders who shaped their destiny. The nation that had once walked as one under David's faithful leadership and Solomon's early wisdom was drifting toward a fracture that no one could yet see, but its foundations were already weakening. The splendor that dazzled the world blinded the people to the cracks forming beneath their feet. The king who sat on the throne had more wealth, knowledge, and power than any ruler before him, but he had begun to forget the God who had placed him there. And when leaders forget the one who raised them up, even the strongest kingdoms begin to tremble. Israel had known victory after victory. Under David, enemies fled, borders expanded, and the people saw what it looked like when a king walked in step with God. Under Solomon, wisdom flowed like a river, and the beauty of the land magnified as the temple rose in unmatched glory. The nations watched with awe. Rulers traveled across deserts just to behold Solomon's brilliance. Silver became as common as stones in Jerusalem. No one imagined that such blessings could fade. No one thought that the unity of the 12 tribes could ever be broken. But blessings become fragile when the heart strays from the one who gives them. As Solomon's kingdom flourished materially, something very different was happening spiritually. A golden age on the outside was turning hollow on the inside. The people did not yet see the danger, for the changes were gradual. What began as one compromise became a habit. What started as a decision made for political advantage soon became a pattern that reshaped the king's character. Without realizing it, the nation was being guided toward a moment that would rewrite its entire future. The king's projects were magnificent. His palace, the fortified cities, the stunning temple that glittered in the sun, these works required a labor force larger than anything Israel had ever seen. At first, the people may have believed it was an honor to contribute to the glory of God's nation. But honors turn into burdens when they demand more strength than a people can give. Each passing year required more laborers, more supplies, more resources. The king who once leaned on God now leaned on the strength of his people, forcing them to carry weight they were never meant to bear. Families felt the strain. Men disappeared into the mountains for months, cutting stone or hauling timber far from home. Mothers watched their sons march away to serve the king's ambitions instead of cultivating their own lands. What had once been a united nation serving God had become a divided workforce serving a man's expanding vision. The northern tribes suffered most, for they were numerous and strong, and so the burden fell heaviest upon them. While Judah rested under the king's favor, the tribes of Israel grew weary of giving everything while receiving little in return. Weariness, however, was only one part of the kingdom's decline. What truly undermined Israel's unity was something far more dangerous: the shift in Solomon's heart. A king's heart shapes a nation's future, and the man who once delighted in God's presence began to delight in alliances, in foreign beauty, in the admiration of nations that worshipped other gods. Each marriage he formed brought another foreign influence into Israel's courts. Each new alliance brought with it another altar, another idol, another compromise. At first, the king might have said these altars were harmless gestures of peace, but the human heart does not fall in an instant. It drifts, and Solomon drifted far from the God who had appeared to him twice and filled his early years with divine wisdom. The smoke from the temple rose to heaven, but now it mixed with smoke from altars built for gods who demanded rituals unworthy of Israel. The same hills that once echoed with David's songs now trembled under the weight of sacrifices not meant for the Lord. And though the people followed their king's commands, many felt the uneasy truth that this was no longer the Israel their fathers knew. The very identity that made them God's chosen nation was being reshaped by influences that never should have entered the land. God watched patiently, but not silently. He sent warnings, not through storms or plagues, but through adversaries who rose like shadows at the borders. These enemies were not just political threats. They were divine signals, reminders that peace is a gift given, not guaranteed. Enemies who had once feared Israel now grew bold, striking where Solomon's strength was weakest. Yet even these signs did not soften the king's heart or turn him back to the path of obedience. The man who once understood the fear of the Lord now feared the loss of his power. God had chosen David's line to reign, and he would not break his promise, but neither would he ignore rebellion. When Solomon refused to listen, God prepared a new leader, a man not from Judah, but from the northern tribes who had suffered under the king's burdens. This man did not come from a royal family or a line of warriors. He rose from among the workers, distinguished only by his diligence and integrity. His name was Jeroboam. Jeroboam was not seeking a throne. He was simply doing the work given to him, and he did it well. So well that Solomon entrusted him with overseeing labor from the tribes of Joseph. This position allowed Jeroboam to witness firsthand the frustrations building among the people. He saw the fathers and sons exhausted by endless labor. He heard their conversations, their quiet complaints, their growing resentment. He understood the heart of the nation in a way Solomon could not from his golden throne. And perhaps without realizing it, Jeroboam's own heart began to align with the people rather than the king. It was during this season of unrest that God sent a prophet, a man named Ahijah. Their meeting was not in a temple or a palace, but along a lonely road outside the city. The prophet approached Jeroboam wearing a new garment, a symbol of something whole and unified. Without speaking, Ahijah tore the cloak into 12 pieces. The sound of the tearing cloth matched the unseen tearing already happening in Israel's soul. He handed Jeroboam 10 of those pieces and spoke words that would forever alter the course of the nation. God was going to split the kingdom. The tribes would no longer walk as one. 10 would follow Jeroboam. 1 would remain with David's line. The division was coming, not because of politics, but because of the king's unfaithfulness. Jeroboam did not ask for this. The prophecy must have stunned him. He had no armies, no palace, no royal blood. Yet God had chosen him to carry the future of the northern tribes. The choice was divine, not human. And with that choice came danger. When word of the prophecy reached Solomon, fear replaced wisdom. Instead of humbling himself before God, he sought to destroy the man God had chosen. That moment revealed more about Solomon's spiritual condition than any idol or altar. A faithful king would have repented. A fearful king attempted murder. Jeroboam fled to Egypt, not as a traitor, but as a man hunted by the very king he once served. In Egypt, he lived as a refugee, watching from a distance as Israel continued its slow descent. He waited, not knowing when God's word would be fulfilled. And while he waited, the people of Israel continued to carry their heavy burdens, unaware that the day of reckoning was approaching. When Solomon died, the atmosphere in Israel changed quickly. A kingdom without its king becomes a kingdom filled with questions. Would the new king follow his father's harsh ways, or would he listen to the cries of the people? Rehoboam, Solomon's son, ascended the throne, but he did not inherit Solomon's early wisdom. He inherited only the broken pieces of a troubled kingdom. And the moment he took the crown, the tribes saw an opportunity they had not had in 40 years. They were ready to speak, to ask for relief, to request the justice they felt they had been denied. They did not gather in Jerusalem, Solomon's proud city. Instead, they traveled to Shechem, the ancient place of covenant, where the nation had once stood united before God. Their choice of location was deliberate. By calling the king to Shechem, the tribes were reminding him that the throne was not above the people. It existed because of the covenant between God and Israel. And that covenant demanded justice, humility, and righteousness from those who ruled. Jeroboam returned from Egypt the moment he heard Solomon was gone. The timing was not coincidence, but divine orchestration. The people welcomed him as a voice for their suffering. Rehoboam likely saw him as a threat, and thus the tensions that had been building for decades came together in one pivotal meeting, a gathering that would decide whether the kingdom would remain united or collapse into division. The representatives of all the tribes stood before the king and spoke with clarity and restraint. They did not accuse. They did not threaten. They simply asked for relief from the crushing burdens Solomon had placed upon them. If the king lightened their load, they would gladly serve him with loyalty. Their request echoed fairness, respect, and hope for a restored unity. For the first time in many years, the fate of the kingdom rested not on the strength of armies, not on the wealth of the palace, not on foreign alliances, but on the wisdom of a single decision. A moment stood before Rehoboam, a moment that could heal or break a nation. And with that moment began the final chapter of Israel's unity. Rehoboam stood before the assembly in Shechem, with a mixture of uncertainty and pride shaping his expression. He was the son of Solomon, grandson of David, heir to the golden legacy of Israel's greatest kings. Yet he felt none of the strength that had defined his predecessors. Their greatness came from their closeness to God. But Rehoboam had grown up watching power rather than earning it. His childhood was spent in the luxury of royal courts, surrounded by servants and tutors, but untouched by the daily struggles of the people he was now expected to rule. The moment he faced the tribes, he sensed the weight of their expectations. The people were no longer dazzled by the glory of Solomon. They were burdened by it, and they were asking the new king to stop the suffering. When the elders spoke on behalf of the people, Rehoboam felt the first test of his reign confront him. They asked for relief from unbearable labor, for an end to endless taxation, for compassion from the throne. Their words were respectful, but their tone carried generations of frustration. Rehoboam could feel their tiredness, their longing for a king who would care for them rather than use them. His mind raced with the possibilities of what would happen if he agreed. Perhaps the kingdom would become united again. Perhaps loyalty would flow to him as it once flowed to his grandfather David. But fear also gripped him. He worried that mercy would be seen as weakness, that easing the burden would shrink the kingdom's power, that stepping away from the strict policies of Solomon would make him look small in comparison. Seeking guidance, he asked for 3 days to consider the request. The people agreed and left, but their eyes lingered on him with hope mixed with uncertainty. When the crowds vanished from the square of Shechem, Rehoboam retreated into the council chambers to seek advice. He began with the elders, the men who had served his father faithfully for decades. Their faces bore the lines of wisdom, carved by years of watching kings rise and fall, armies march, and God's hand guide Israel through triumph and trouble. The elders spoke with calm certainty. They told him that a king must carry his people, not crush them, that mercy builds loyalty more than fear ever could. They reminded him that David had captured hearts by serving with humility and justice, not by demanding submission. If the king showed kindness today, the people would remain faithful to him for the rest of his life. Their words were rooted in experience drawn from battles fought, treaties made, and moments when choosing compassion had prevented disaster. Rehoboam listened, but something inside him resisted. He did not want to become a servant king. He wanted to be powerful like Solomon, admired like David. He wanted the people to fear disobedience, not negotiate with their ruler. When the elders left, Rehoboam turned to the young men who had grown up with him, his friends, his companions, men who had enjoyed the privileges of palace life, but knew nothing of governance or the weight of responsibility. These young advisors had never felt the pain of the common people. They had never worked under the sun, never carried heavy loads, never missed fathers who had been taken for royal labor. They knew only what it felt like to be served. Their hearts were shaped by pride, and their advice reflected the arrogance of youth. They told Rehoboam to reject the people's request. They urged him to prove his authority, to show strength, to establish dominance early. They mocked the elders' counsel, calling it weakness. They filled Rehoboam's ears with promises that firmness would keep the kingdom strong. They told him to increase the burdens, not reduce them, to remind Israel that the king's word was unchallengeable. These were not words of wisdom, but of fear disguised as courage. And yet, Rehoboam felt drawn to them. They made him feel powerful, decisive, unshakable. 3 days passed quickly, and the people returned with anticipation. They had waited decades for this moment. They had endured labor, taxes, and suffering through much of Solomon's reign. Now, a new king stood before them, and hope flickered in their hearts. Perhaps God had given them a ruler who would restore justice. Perhaps unity could be rebuilt. Perhaps the wounds of forced labor could finally begin to heal. Jeroboam stood among the tribes, representing their voice. He watched Rehoboam carefully, sensing that the young king's response would determine not only the future of the kingdom, but his own future as well. The people gathered in silence as Rehoboam stepped forward. His expression revealed nothing. His voice was steady, but the words he spoke crushed the hope that had risen days earlier. He told the people that his father had laid a heavy yoke upon them, but he would make it heavier, that Solomon had punished with whips, but he would punish with scourges. His tone carried pride, not concern. His words were a declaration, not a conversation. And as the message echoed across the assembly, the people felt as though a hammer had struck the fragile unity of Israel. A silence spread over Shechem, thick with disbelief. Mothers who had prayed for mercy lowered their eyes. Fathers who had carried stones for Solomon felt anger rise like fire in their chests. Young men who had never known peace from labor clenched their fists. Rehoboam had not simply refused their request, he had dismissed their suffering. In that moment, the bond between the king and the people snapped. The tribes looked at one another with the realization that they could not follow a king who treated them as burdens. Their loyalty was not blind. Israel had formed under God's command, not royal force. And if the king refused to serve the people were not bound to serve the king. Jeroboam stepped forward with courage, speaking words that would change Israel's story forever. The people declared they had no portion in David, no inheritance in the son of Jesse. They turned their backs on the house of David and returned to their own homes, choosing independence over oppression. Rehoboam watched the crowd scatter, but he did not understand what had just happened. He thought their rejection was temporary, a moment of anger that would fade. He believed his authority came from his lineage, not realizing that a king without the people's heart possesses only an empty crown. His first act was to send Adoniram, the overseer of forced labor, to restore order. But the northern tribes, filled with righteous fury, stoned him to death. It was not an act of rebellion, but a declaration that they would no longer submit to injustice. When Rehoboam heard of Adoniram's death, fear finally struck him. He fled to Jerusalem, protected by the walls of Judah, but separated from the loyalty of Israel. The northern tribes gathered at once and made Jeroboam their king. The prophecy given by Ahijah was unfolding exactly as God had spoken. 10 tribes united under Jeroboam, forming the kingdom of Israel. Only Judah and Benjamin remained with Rehoboam. A once united people had become 2 nations, divided by pride, oppression, and the spiritual downfall of their leaders. But the division did not end with politics. Its roots ran deeper, forming spiritual consequences that would shape both kingdoms for generations. Jeroboam, now ruling over a vast land, feared that if his people traveled to Jerusalem to worship, their hearts might return to the house of David. Fear is a dangerous counselor, and Jeroboam allowed it to guide him into decisions that mirrored the mistakes of Solomon. He created places of worship in Bethel and Dan, crafting golden calves for the people to bow before. He told them these idols represented the God who brought them out of Egypt, repeating the same sin that had once enraged Moses at Sinai. The people followed Jeroboam because they trusted his leadership, not understanding that he was leading them away from the Lord. Priests who were not of Levi were chosen to serve at these new altars. Festivals were established that imitated those commanded by God, but with none of the holiness. The northern kingdom began walking down a path that would lead to its destruction many generations later. A king who had received God's promise was now shaping a future built on disobedience. Meanwhile, Rehoboam in Judah was struggling to maintain stability. Though he still possessed the city of Jerusalem and the temple, his heart was troubled by the loss of the majority of Israel. His pride had cost him more than he could have imagined. And God sent another message through the prophet Shemaiah, warning him not to wage war against the northern tribes. The division was from the Lord, and fighting against it would be fighting against God's will. Reluctantly, Rehoboam obeyed, and a civil war was prevented. But peace did not mean unity. The wound had been opened, and no human effort could close it. Jerusalem remained the center of worship for Judah, but even there, the spiritual health of the nation began to weaken. The leaders did not turn their hearts fully back to God, and the influence of Solomon's idolatry echoed long after his death. The kingdom of Judah struggled between moments of faithfulness and seasons of rebellion, never fully restored to the purity that David once modeled. As years passed, the consequences of the division became evident. Families were separated by borders. Traditions once shared became distinct and distant. The unity that had once allowed Israel to defeat giants and conquer nations was replaced by rivalry, suspicion, and fear. Enemies who once trembled at the sight of Israel's armies now saw an opportunity to strike. And as the two kingdoms drifted further apart, They forgot that their true strength came not from their kings, but from their covenant with God. The once great nation, chosen to shine as a light among the nations, now stood fractured, dimmed by disobedience and pride. The people who had crossed the Red Sea together, who had marched around Jericho together, who had worshipped at the foot of Sinai together, were now divided by earthly loyalties that distracted them from the God who had rescued them countless times. Yet even in this division, God's plan continued to unfold. His promises to David remained unbroken. His patience with Israel remained unshaken. Though kings failed and people turned away, God's purpose moved steadily forward, shaping a future far greater than any human kingdom. In the midst of political chaos and spiritual decay, the whispers of prophecy continued, pointing toward a coming Messiah who would restore what sin had broken and bring unity where division had reigned. The division of Israel and Judah was not merely a political split. It became a slow unraveling of identity, purpose, and destiny. What began as a single decision by a proud king turned into generations of struggle that neither kingdom could fully escape. The people could still remember a time when all 12 tribes walked together under one banner, worshipped in one temple, and fought their battles side by side. But memories fade, and with each passing year, the unity that once defined them felt more like a distant echo than a living truth. A nation chosen by God to be a light had now become two flickering flames, each battling winds that threatened to extinguish them. Jeroboam, who had risen from a labor supervisor to the ruler of 10 tribes, began his reign with confidence, but quickly found himself trapped by fear. Though God had promised him a lasting dynasty if he obeyed, Jeroboam allowed insecurity to shape his decisions. Instead of trusting that God could keep the hearts of his people loyal, he believed that worship itself was his enemy. He feared that if the northern tribes traveled to Jerusalem to offer sacrifices, they would remember their connection to David's house. And so Jeroboam built altars in Bethel and Dan, convincing the people that these were the proper places to worship. He told them the golden calves represented the God who had delivered Israel from Egypt. But the symbol he chose carried the weight of Israel's darkest rebellion, a reminder of the moment when they had turned from God at Mount Sinai. Jeroboam repeated a sin that had nearly destroyed the nation before it even reached the Promised Land. The priests he appointed were not chosen by God, nor did they come from the tribe of Levi. These were men selected for convenience, loyalty, or influence, not for spiritual faithfulness. Step by step, the northern kingdom drifted farther from the path God had given them. At first, the people did not realize the danger. The festivals Jeroboam created looked familiar. The sacrifices seemed meaningful, and the rituals felt comforting. But worship shaped identity, and identity shaped destiny. As Israel began worshiping in ways God had not commanded, their hearts slowly hardened. The presence of God, which had once guided them through deserts and delivered them from enemies, began to withdraw. A kingdom that had been chosen to reveal God to the world was now walking in darkness of its own making. In Judah, Rehoboam was learning lessons of his own. Losing 10 tribes had wounded his pride, but it also humbled him in ways he had not expected. When the prophet warned him not to attack Israel, he obeyed. It was the first wise decision he had made as king. Yet obedience in one moment did not guarantee faithfulness in the next. As years passed, Rehoboam allowed the influence of foreign gods to spread through Judah. High places, sacred poles, and pagan rituals began to appear even within sight of Jerusalem. The people followed these practices because their king did not stop them. And so Judah, though still connected to the temple, carried within it the seeds of corruption. The spiritual decay in both kingdoms soon drew the attention of foreign powers. Egypt, which had once offered refuge to Jeroboam, now saw an opportunity to strike. Pharaoh Shishak marched against Judah with a vast army, conquering fortified cities and threatening Jerusalem itself. Rehoboam and his leaders trembled at the sight of the invading forces. When the prophet Shemaiah confronted them, he told them plainly that this invasion was God's judgment for abandoning him. Rehoboam and the leaders humbled themselves, confessing that God was right to discipline them. Because of their humility, Jerusalem was spared, though its treasures were taken as tribute. The shields of gold that Solomon had once displayed in the palace were replaced by shields of bronze, a silent reminder that the glory of the past had been traded for a lesser future. Meanwhile, in Israel, Jeroboam faced his own moment of confrontation. A man of God traveled from Judah to Bethel to deliver a message of judgment against the altar Jeroboam had built. In the middle of a sacrifice, the prophet cried out that a future son of David would rise to destroy the altar and burn the bones of the idolatrous priests upon it. Jeroboam, furious and threatened, stretched out his hand to order the prophet's arrest. But the moment he lifted his arm, it froze in place, shriveled, and became useless. Terror filled him as the altar beside him cracked and spilled ashes to the ground. These signs should have turned Jeroboam's heart back to God, but he chose repentance only for his wounded hand, not for his wounded soul. The prophet prayed. Jeroboam's hand was restored, but the king returned to his sin, preserving the idols that would bring ruin to his kingdom. The northern tribes watched as their leaders drifted further from God's ways. Children grew up hearing different instructions than their ancestors had followed. The sacred calendar changed. The priesthood changed. Their understanding of God changed. What had once been a unified faith slowly fragmented into something unrecognizable. Prophets were sent to warn them. Signs were given to awaken them. But the people had learned to follow convenience rather than truth, and convenience often speaks louder than conscience. Generations passed, and the consequences of the split became clearer. The two kingdoms frequently clashed, each blaming the other for their hardships. Brothers who once fought side by side against giants now raised swords against one another. Battles spilled blood that once had been shed only against foreign enemies. Israel and Judah forgot that they were bound by one covenant, one heritage, and one God. Their pride blinded them to the reality that division made them vulnerable. As Israel drifted deeper into sin, God raised prophets to call them back. Elijah confronted kings, performed miracles, and stood against a nation drowning in idolatry. Fire fell from heaven on Mount Carmel, proving that the Lord alone was God. But even miracles could not permanently change a kingdom whose heart was set on rebellion. After Elijah came Elisha, who performed wonders that shook the land and revealed God's mercy once more. Yet each miracle was like sunlight falling on barren ground, bright but unable to take root. Israel's kings continued leading the nation into darkness. One dynasty rose violently and fell violently. Another replaced it, then collapsed under its own weight. Each king seemed determined to distance himself further from God than the one before him. Prophets were silenced, ignored, or persecuted. People who once followed the pillar of fire in the wilderness now followed empty rituals that carried no life. The farther the nation drifted, the closer judgment approached. The kingdom of Judah, though often more faithful than Israel, had its own struggles. Some kings attempted to restore worship, cleanse the land of idols, and bring people back to God's ways. These moments offered brief hope, glimmers of what Judah could have been. But each revival was short-lived, for the next generation often returned to corruption. Without steady leadership, the people wavered between obedience and rebellion. The temple in Jerusalem still stood in glory, but its courts were at times filled with worshippers whose hearts were elsewhere. As centuries passed, the consequences of the original division continued to unfold like a thread unraveling through time. The northern kingdom grew increasingly weak as enemies pressed in from every direction. The prophets warned Israel repeatedly that destruction awaited them if they did not turn back to God. They compared Israel to a vine that had lost its fruit, a shepherdless flock wandering toward predators, a stubborn child refusing to learn. But the warnings went unheard. Finally, the day of judgment arrived. The Assyrian Empire swept across the land with brutal force, conquering cities and scattering the people. Samaria fell after a long siege, and the kingdom of Israel was no more. The 10 tribes were taken into exile, dispersed across foreign lands, never again to unite as they once had. Their identity faded into history, remembered only in songs and stories. The people who had once seen God split the Red Sea were now lost among nations that did not know their name. Judah watched this tragedy from a distance, shaken but unbroken. Some kings used the fall of Israel as a warning, turning back to God with renewed devotion. Others ignored the lessons and repeated the same mistakes. The prophets continued to speak, calling Judah to repentance, reminding them of God's promises and warnings. But like Israel, Judah's faithfulness wavered. Eventually, Babylon rose to power, and Judah faced the same judgment Israel had experienced. Jerusalem fell, the temple was destroyed, and the people were carried into exile. The city that once glowed with divine glory now lay in ruins. The kingdom that had once stood united under David and Solomon was scattered, broken by centuries of disobedience. Yet even in tragedy, God preserved hope. A remnant survived. Prophets spoke of restoration, a return to the land, and a future king from David's line who would rule with justice and peace. The split of the kingdom had revealed the fragility of human leadership and the danger of trusting in kings rather than in God. It showed that unity cannot survive when pride rules the heart, and that a nation without spiritual foundation cannot stand. But it also prepared the way for something greater, the longing for unity, for a righteous king, for a kingdom that could never be divided again, became a thread woven through Israel's story. Prophets began speaking of a coming Messiah, a shepherd who would gather the scattered flock, a ruler who would restore justice, a light for the nations. Generations later, in a quiet town in Judah, that promise would be fulfilled. A child from David's line would be born, not in a palace, but in a manger. He would not carry a sword, but would heal the broken-hearted. He would not demand labor, but would offer rest for weary souls. He would not divide tribes, but unite all people under one kingdom that could never fall. The echoes of Israel's divided past would find their answer in him. Where Solomon failed, he would succeed. Where Jeroboam led the people astray, he would lead them back. Where Rehoboam brought division, he would bring reconciliation. The story of Israel and Judah's division is a story of human weakness, but also of divine faithfulness. It reminds us that God's purposes continue even when his people falter. Though kingdoms crumble and leaders fail, God's plan moves steadily toward restoration. The tragedy of the divided kingdom became the soil in which the promise of a united eternal kingdom would grow. The people who once saw their land torn in two would eventually witness a kingdom not built by human hands, a kingdom of the heart and spirit, founded not on political power, but on the love and truth of God himself. The division that began with pride and fear would one day be healed by humility and sacrifice. The broken pieces of Israel's history would be gathered into the hands of the one who could make all